It's 11 o'clock, and we're so happy to introduce Judy Borie interviewing Sherwin Markman. We enjoyed it so much last week, and we're looking forward to this week. And you're on.
Are mics live?
You're live.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see everybody back.
Good morning, Judy.
Good morning, Sherwin. We are in the second interview, and this deals with the West Wing. Sherwin and the West Wing. As we start, LBJ has been elected. Where we're starting is he has already taken the oath, been inaugurated
On his own.
on his own. And it's important to remember that for him was a very important moment. He was not the vice president that had moved into the presidency, but he was elected on his own. Good morning. So, Sherwin, where were you when you got what I call the fateful phone call?
It was the spring of 1965. Lyndon Johnson been elected on his own, which was very, very important to him, as you suggest. Excuse me. And I was practicing law. The election was over. I was back in my office in Des Moines, happily practicing my profession, when I received a phone call from Marvin Watson, who was his newly appointed chief of staff. You recall, I may have mentioned Walter Jenkins, who had been his chief of staff for many, many years, had a breakdown and had to be replaced because he'd been found in a homosexual situation at YMCA and had been arrested twice for that. So Marvin came in January of 1965, and it wasn't too long after that I received this phone call.
And what did he say?
Well, he said, if you can arrange it, we'd like you to travel to Washington, come to the White House, and visit with the president. And I said, what about? And he said, we'll let you know when you get here. So I went.
Okay, so you went. So what happened?
Well, Marvin escorted me into the Oval Office. President was there, and basically he said, I'd like you to come work for me. And that kind of came as a shock to me, to say the least. And my initial reaction was to resist it. Actually, what I said was, I'm quite content in Des Moines. I want to help you, Mr. President, but
You like living
I
in.
like Iowa. I was born there. I was raised there. I went to school there. Well, then he started, as only Lyndon Johnson could, with his arm twisting method. He could be very, very effective. He was very, very good at that. And I was just his latest victim. So at the end of it, basically what he was saying to me was, your president needs you. And it's very hard for anybody to sit there in the Oval Office across from the president of the United States and say no. And I didn't.
And you didn't.
So in June or thereabouts of 1965, I came to Washington.
Now, one of your first assignments was to take two senators, as I recall.
Two representatives.
Two representatives, I'm sorry. Tell the story of your first trip.
Well, to my surprise, the president did not bring me immediately to the White House. He put me in the Department of State in the Agency for International development, which is a foreign aid thing, with the instruction that we have the Alliance for Progress, which is our program to help out Latin American countries, and we're having trouble getting the appropriation through Congress. And there's two very significant members of Congress who control that money. And I want you to work with them until we get that money approved. Well, I didn't know anything about the Congress, and I didn't know anything about the foreign aid program. I didn't know anything about the Department of State to speak of, but I said, yes, sir. So
Good
my
idea.
first job, without any particular background in it, was to escort Mark Andrews, who was a Republican congressman from South Dakota, could have been North Dakota, one of the Dakotas, and Julia Butler Hanson, who was a congresswoman from Washington State. And it was the beginning of an incredibly close relationship, especially with Julia, that I developed. Julia had been leader of the Democratic Party in the state legislature in Washington State, was a marvelous woman, strong and forceful yet soft, a writer of children's books, and yet strong enough to be a leader. And it was an adventure with Julia. Anyway, just to go on, so I was given the job of escorting them down to Latin America and somehow being persuasive of them to get them to approve appropriation for the foreign aid program down there. And my first run-in with Julia showed me what I didn't know about anything, including Emily Post. What happened was our first dinner, I'll never forget this. Our first dinner was at the ambassador's residence in Bogota, Colombia. And he had a formal dinner, and he had a rectangular table like this, and he had people around it, and he was seated like in the center there, and Julie had a place to sit toward the end of the table. And we walked in, Julia escorted by me, and we stopped. And Julia turned to me, well, I'm not going in there and sit. I said, what? And she said to me, he seated me below the salt. To which I said, what in the world are you talking about? He said, he's sitting me below the salt. You come with me. So she turned around, left the dining room, the people all in place, and explained to me that under protocol, I don't know where it's, never actually read about it, that if you have a seating arrangement like table like this, the guest of honor should be between the salt and the host. And she was below the salt. So she said, you got to fix that, Sherwin. Mind you, this is my first experience with her, with an embassy, having a dinner in an embassy, of just this Iowa guy who just come up. So I left her in the anteroom, and I go back to the dining room. I lean over the ambassador, and I whispered to him that he's got to change the seating arrangements. But he, and I had to do it in a strong enough voice that he had to do it, and he did it. And that was my first experience. In any event, what that led to, of course, we completed the journey. We went to many countries in Latin America, and it was a successful trip. The money came through for the foreign aid program, and it was the beginning of a friendship between Julia and me that lasted throughout Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Just to show you how it evolved, Julia was a good, dependable liberal vote. So she was always voting for whatever it is the president was proposing in the Great Society program. We never really had to ask her for anything. On the other hand, she used to call me her guy in the White House. Anytime anybody in her congressional district got in trouble, she felt free to call me, and I did what I could to help. But I never had to ask her for anything. And then in the middle of 1968, we were building the Kennedy Center. And by that time, Julia was not only the first woman chair of an important appropriations subcommittee, but she controlled the money that would be needed from the federal government to build the Kennedy Center. And the person who was trying to raise that money was Roger Stevens. Stevens was an impresario from Broadway, and his job was to raise the money, including dealing with Julia. So he came back to the president and said, she's against it. She is not going to give me the money for the Kennedy Center. And the president directed Stevens to me, and I went up to Julia. This is at the end of our relationship in Washington, really, and basically said to her, Julia, through all these years, I've never had to ask you for a thing. Through all these years, I've done whatever you needed in the White House, and now I'm asking. And she said, yes. If I could just add to that.
Sure,
story.
you can.
There's another one. There's another situation which also illustrates the relationship the president required between people on his staff.
Sound?
Well, I'll try to compete with the drill. Am I speaking loudly enough?
We're hearing you
Another
fine.
totally different situation, but illustrates the relationship Johnson required and had with members of Congress. And this one involves a very powerful male member of Congress, Wayne Hayes. Now, Wayne Hayes, you may remember because later on he got in trouble.
He got in a lot of
He
trouble.
got in a lot of trouble with girls. But at this point, and this was early on too, he was a very powerful member of Congress who controlled legislation that had to do with the State Department. And he was also known as, and this is a fact, a bully. He was a bully. In any event, I was in Paris. This was early on, I think the fall of 1966. And I was invited to a party at the ambassador's residence in Paris. And I walk into the reception area and I see over in a corner a group of French diplomats being regaled by Wayne Harris. And I walked over and Harris was drunk. Hayes, I mean, was drunk. And he was saying awful things about Lyndon Johnson. That Lyndon Johnson
The
couldn't be
French
dependent.
diplomats. He's talking to,
This is Wayne Hayes, a powerful member of Congress, in his drunken way, excoriating Lyndon Johnson, that he can't be trusted. He's a crook. He's this, that. He was just terrible. And I stood there for just a moment and then I interrupted him. And I said, Congressman, you should not be talking like this at a foreign embassy to foreign diplomats. To which he sort of grunted and huffed and puffed and then marched away. And I thought, that's the end of it. Well, I go back to my hotel room and in the middle of the night, the phone rings and it's Hayes, still sounding drunk and saying, you little son of a bitch, I'm going to destroy you. When I get back to Washington, I'm going to tell the president to fire you. And I guarantee you he's going to do what I say. Well, I thought, well, that's just more drunken stuff. And anyway, I go back to Washington. I get summoned into the Oval Office. And LBJ says to me, what in the hell did you do with Wayne Hayes? And I, feeling proud of myself for having defended the president, tells him the story. And he said, well, Hayes called me and wants me to fire you. I'm not going to fire you. He said, I'm not going to let anybody from the Congress ever tell me who can work for me. But what I am going to do is instruct you to go up to Capitol Hill and
No,
put on your best acting talent and apologize to Wayne Hill. Wayne Hayes.
no.
Tell him whatever you have to tell him, but I want you to make him happy. So feeling like I should just fall under the ground, I took a White House car up to the Hill, went up to Wayne Hayes's office, walked in and said, Congressman Hayes, I am sorry. Forgive me, forgive me. And I went on that for about a minute, and suddenly Hayes's expression changed from one from anger to one of friendly. Suddenly I was his new best friend. And I stayed there for an hour while he's regaling me with this story and that story. And I just felt terrible and went back to the president, told him I did what you wanted, sir, but I feel awful. But he said you did the right thing. So that's how.
Now, it was Wayne Hayes that was caught in a fountain with somebody, wasn't that?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that.
I didn't pay a lot.
Someone of the females.
I did not pay attention to that.
All right, so let's move on to one of the more challenging things you did, but that I think probably was incredibly useful to LBJ. Tell us about your field trips to the ghetto.
Well, this was unique. I think it was Attorney General Katzenbach who came up with the idea. But in any event, we were all sitting in the cabinet room. And at the end of it, the president says, I've got this idea of sending one of you young men, or most of them men, into the ghettos to tell me what programs are working and what programs are not working. And what is this Black Power thing they're all talking about? What does that mean? And anybody wants to volunteer, come on into the Oval Office. So he left, and I'm the only one that follows him in. So he sits there and he said, what I want you and others, if you can get them to do it, to go into the worst ghettos in the United States. Now, this is the dead of winter, 1967, I think, 66, 67. I want you to go into the worst ghettos. I want you to live in those ghettos. I don't want you to be commuting to those ghettos. And I want you to stay there as long as you need to. And I want you to tell me what programs are working, why they're working, what programs are not working, and why, and what programs are not working. And Black Power, I don't want anybody to know you're from the White House. I don't want you to get in trouble. Don't want you to get your name in the newspaper. I just want you to do it and report back to me. To which my response was, how am I supposed to do this, Mr. President? He said, well, you're a bright young man, Markman. You can figure it out. But everything that I'm telling you, you should do. And since you're the only one that came in with me, I want you to be in charge of the program if anyone else wants it. Well, I figured out that the only way I could do this was to get somebody who was African-American to go with me. Obviously, I am who I am. I'm white. I'm from Iowa. I'm just like the foreign aid program. I didn't know much about the program in the white ghettos either. But this is what he wanted, and that's exactly why he wanted me there, whether it made sense or not. So I had to find someone to escort me in, and I found Kenny Vallis, terrific guy, African-American, who had been born and raised on the south side of Chicago and was then working in the Department of Labor. And I found him through a mutual friend. So the first place we went was Chicago. And it was winter and it was a blizzard and it was terrible weather. And we got ourselves rooms at a rooming house, and we stayed there for about 10 days. And we talked, I can't tell you how many people we talked to. I can no longer tell you how many programs we looked at, but it was an amazing experience for a young man like me. And I got back to Washington at the end of it, and the president wanted me to write a memorandum about that. And I know his memoranda, he liked to be 1 page or less. So I started dictating it and writing, and it ended up to be about 10 or 12 pages, single space to my report. I mean, I was so full of what I was thinking and the reactions I had and what I had seen and what I felt. And I couldn't cut it and cut it back. So I set the whole 10 single pages into the president, thinking, well, I'm going to hear back from him about the length of my memorandum. But I sent it in, and I didn't hear a word, not a word. Later, I discovered one of the reasons he wanted to use it. I was in the cabinet room. We had a bunch of congressmen, and one of his Great Society programs was up for consideration, and he was lobbying him. And I'm sitting there in the back of the cabinet room, and I see him reach into his coat pocket, pull out the sheaf of papers, and he starts reading from it. And it's my memo. So he used it. What was in that memo? One of these books, this one, The Great Society, quotes from it at length. Great Society is written, The Great Society, the high type of liberalism, is written by one of the heads of the history department at the University of Virginia, Milkus, who interviewed me at some length. Without reading it, it's hard for me to give the sense of what I was saying. One of the things, just two things I can say. One is I was trying to assure the president it was nothing about the concept of Black power that should concern him. That Black power had to do with pride of African Americans. It was not a threat of violence. It was a threat of pride in their own community. And the second thing I came in with is if these programs are to work, African Americans had to think of them as their own programs, not programs being imposed on them or dictated to them by white America. And much, much more, as I say, it's in here. And everything that I wrote in those memos came from the heart. So that worked. And
that wasn't your first trip.
That was my first trip.
I mean, that was, yeah, but it wasn't your only trip.
Yeah. So after that, I went to Oakland and did approximately the same thing, except while I was at Oakland, the president sent word to me that he wants me to go up and sit in at Berkeley, University of California, which was a hotbed of anti-war.
Oh,
So as long as I'm trying to find out what Black Power is about, he'd like to know what student power is all about too. Well, since I was only in my early 30s then, I could pass, no longer, but back then I could pass as a student.
Did
So
you
I-
dress like a student?
Yeah, I dressed like a student. I took off my coat and tie and sort of hung out at Berkeley, especially at the popular bars. Stay there late at night. I remember one long evening, I spoke with a woman who was identified as Stokely Carmichael's girlfriend, who was one of the activists, a very famous activist. And so I did Berkeley and Oakland. And then the third one I went to, by the way, I returned to these same places a year later. But the third one, which I really want to mention, is Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, I had an entree. Leon Higginbottom, who was a federal judge here in Philadelphia, had been a classmate of mine at Yale Law School. And not only had he been a classmate, but he had been a very close friend of mine. We had hit it off as students, and I followed his career avidly, tried to get him appointed. I would really had him in mind as a possible Supreme Court justice, but we were never able to pull anything like that off. But so I called Leon, Judge Higginbottom, and I told him what the president was. He says, "You're not going to live in any ghetto or rooming house. You're going to live with me and my wife." So who am I to argue? So I came and stayed with the Higginbottoms. And the first, and we did the same thing, actually, wandered around Philadelphia, looking at this and that program, talking to lots of people. Sunday came of that week I was there. And he says, "You're going to church with me." And I said, "Sure enough." And so and the weather was terrible. It was sleet. It seemed like all these trips were in the dead of winter. Never got good weather. Anyway, it was a lousy day. And he took me to this church. All I remember about the church is a big church. It was on a hill and the weather was awful. And I thought going in, there won't be anybody there because the weather's so bad. So I walk in the church and it's jammed. It's jammed. And Judge Higginbottom and I sat in the back, and the preacher was a man by the name of Leon Sullivan. So we sit there through the whole service, and I'm impressed by him as a preacher. After the service, Judge Higginbottom, the two Leons here, so forgive me. Judge Higginbottom introduces me to Reverend Sullivan, and we start talking. And Sullivan says to me, "You got to see my job training program." And I said, "Of course, that's one of the reasons I'm here for." And so we made a date for Monday, the next day, and Judge Higginbottom took me out, and we went to his program, Sullivan's program, which was called OIC, Opportunities Industrial. I can't remember what the C was, but it was it was a job training program. And I was really impressed. Spent the whole day there. I did, watching and learning and chatting with Sullivan. I was really, really blown away by the charisma of Sullivan and by the wisdom of the program that he had. It wasn't just job training, but he had worked it so that he had associations with industries so that at the end of the training, these people had jobs. It was an amazing thing, and he was an amazing man. And I was really impressed. when I got back to Washington, I met with LBJ and I told him about Reverend Sullivan. I said, here's a program you've got to see, and here's a man you simply must meet. I mean, he's one of the extraordinary people that I've ever met. And he's the best thing that ever happened to the Great Society program. And the president agreed. The Secret Service gave us a hard time. They didn't want me to bring him into the ghetto of Philadelphia. They didn't think it was safe, but it was. And we brought Johnson into Philadelphia and introduced him to Sullivan. And he spent quite a while going through the OIC. And we got back to Washington. The president was every bit as impressed with Leon Sullivan as I had been. And he says to me, Johnson, you got to get this man money. Right away, you got to get this. This was Johnson. He couldn't delay things. This is a weekend. It's a Saturday, as a matter of fact. I remember that. He says, and the money is controlled by Sergeant Shriver, Jack Kennedy's brother-in-law. He said, you call Shriver today, right now, and get Sullivan money. So I call Shriver's office. Of course, it's a Saturday, nobody's there. It turns out that Shriver is having a lawn party at his house. And Johnson says, well, you go on out to that party, you get him out of that party, and you get Sullivan money. So, uninvited, I went out to Shriver's house, got Shriver out of the party, and we got Sullivan money. And I got to add that every time I met Reverend Sullivan after that on the streets of Washington or wherever, and I did meet with him, he would say to me, Sherwin, I'm praying for you. So it was worth the effort in the long run anyway.
That's a wonderful story. I did some research on OIC, although I was privileged to hear him. I was in graduate school here at that time. One of their slogans that I loved, don't buy where you can't work. That really hit it. Okay, so now we're doing fun on time, but we've got a lot of stories. Now,
Sorry, everybody.
I know where you want to end. You want to end with Williamsburg. But tell us about Lady Bird and your relationship with Lady Bird.
Well, I loved Lady Bird. She was as soft and as real as any person you would ever meet. And she cared. And she was strong. I think, didn't I tell the story of Walter Jenkins last time?
Mhm.
She stood up for Walter when he had to be fired.
In fact, she talked LBJ out of firing him, didn't she?
Right. We gave him lifetime. She arranged for him to have lifetime work for their TV station down in Austin. And if you listen to the recordings, and there are some of her private conversations with her husband, you can see that he listened to her. He really did pay attention to her, and that he couldn't bully her. I mean, and he would listen to her. If you talk to her daughters, Linda or Lucy, they'll tell you how strong she was and how much the president depended on her wisdom. Just a couple incidents. One, I'm going to talk about the summer conference with the Russians, but there's an instance where she stood up there. But also I talked about my trips into the inner city. And she always took me aside. I remember one day, I don't know what was going on inside the White House, but she told me to join her out on the lawn. And we sat there right outside of the White House, and she wanted to hear everything that I could remember about my trips into the inner city. But she was a love, and there's this unique experience I had with her toward the end of her life. I think this was the last Christmas she was with us. She celebrated her birthday before Christmas, and I came down to Austin for that. And then she asked me if I would join her at the ranch, which is an hour or so's drive from Austin. So Lady Bird and I and Lucy and Lady Bird's Secret Service agent drove down to the ranch. And we got out of the car at the end of the driveway. It's a long driveway into the ranch house. And that driveway, and this was just before Christmas, and that driveway was lined with, I don't know how many people, but lots of people on both sides. And we walked down that driveway with all these people, and the love that I felt washing over Lady Bird was palpable. I swear, I could feel it. It was just an incredible thing. And I'd never experienced anything like that before. I mean, the love wasn't for me, it was for her. And it was something to experience. At the end of the driveway, there was a creche, the regular Christmas dress with the lambs and so forth, and the wise men, and all played by little children. And then we had dinner at the ranch. It was quite an experience. I just want to add that experience of feeling overwhelmed by love for someone else occurred to me one other time, and that was not so long ago, while he was still alive. John Lewis. You remember John Lewis, Congressman Lewis from Atlanta. I was up in New York for some conference on the civil rights movement, and the speaker there was Congressman Lewis. So after the speech, and as it was breaking up, Congressman Lewis and I are chatting in the vestibule, and he said, "Are you going back to Washington?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You want to ride with me?" I said, "Of course." And so he invited me to join him. He had a driver and a car, and we drove to Pennsylvania Station. And then he walked from the car to the train, and the same thing happened. People started lining up with John Lewis, and this same feeling of love for him washed over me that I had felt with Lady Bird all those years before. And then, of course, I sat with Congressman Lewis on the train all the way back to Washington, and just was sort of like an acolyte at his feet, just absorbing all the things he had to say, Andrew Pettis Bridge and Dr. King and all of that. So it was a terrific moment.
Now, I'm watching the clock because I've got two stories I want to ask you about. We're going to end with the Williamsburg story, but the story about Air Force One and your boss, the chief of staff, you were down in Uruguay.
Well, excuse me.
I'm kind of cutting through the beginning.
Well, Air Force One, really had two odd experiences. One had to do with the summit conference I was in charge of with the Russians in June of 1967. And this was after that. There was it's so funny. It's bizarre. There was a summit conference that was going to be held in Punta del Este in Uruguay. of all the Latin American countries. And the president was going to attend. I was supposed to attend with him. But shortly before that conference began, Jim Cross, later General Cross, who was the pilot of Air Force One, came to us and said, well, here we got a problem. We can carry enough fuel to fly from Andrews Air Force Base to Punta del Este nonstop, but the runway down there isn't long enough, so we can't put enough fuel on to get all the way back to Andrews Air Force Base. So we're going to have to stop somewhere and refuel on our way home, which wouldn't seem like a problem, except the State Department intervened and said, whoa, 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 you can't stop to refuel at any country that's represented at the summit conference, because that'll insult.
All the other
Don't ask me
countries.
why they felt that way.
It would
but that's what
insult
they said.
all the other countries.
You'd insult them. So we're gonna have to find a country that isn't represented at the summit conference where you can stop and refuel. Well, who are we to argue with the State Department? I mean, they run us anyway. So the State Department gets their heads together and they come up. You all right, man? Okay. The State Department comes up with Guinea or Guyana, I forget, I might not have that right. That's a place that isn't going to be represented, and you can stop there and we can stop there and refuel. So at that point, now, for a president to refuel on Air Force One isn't just like driving into your neighborhood filling station. It's a happening. Whatever the country is, they're going to want to greet him and do this and that and the other thing. It's going to take a while and arrangements have to be made. So at that point, the president says to me, you're not coming to Punta del Este. You're going to go to Guyana. I hope I have that right. Anyway, you got to go Guyana and arrange, because arrangements have to be made for us to stop there to refuel. And of course, I said, yes, sir. And so we get on a big Air Force plane, passenger plane, about the size of Air Force One. And I get the whole team, Secret Service, State Department people, security people. I mean, it's not just me, it's a whole group.
Sure.
And we fly down to Guyana and we land and we stop. The pilot gets off the plane, and about 5 minutes later, he gets back on the plane. He says, Markman, come with me. Since I'm supposedly in charge. So I get off this Air Force plane. We start walking down the runway, and he starts pointing here and there. There are huge potholes in the runway. He said, I'm never going to let Air Force One land here. Lucky if we don't crash and burn. I said, we were able to land here. Well, we're not important. And the Air Force One may not be as lucky. In any event, I'm calling General Cross, it's Colonel Cross, and tell him we can't bring Air Force One down here. Well, we climb back on the airplane. I go up into the cockpit and I get Marvin Watson, Chief of Staff, on the phone. And I tell him my tale of woe. I said, what do we do now? I said, the Guianan ambassador or foreign minister is on his way to greet us. They're all ready to make arrangements here. And Marvin says to me, take off. I said, take off to where? He says, we don't know yet. What about the foreign minister? Forget about him. Just take off. Well, being a good soldier, we take off. So we're flying over South America with no place to land.
And wasn't it getting late?
Yes, it's nighttime. And So after a while, I get it, radio comes on, it's Marvin. He says, you're going to Suriname. It's just south of you. Suriname's a country. I said to Marvin innocently, have we been invited? No. Do they know we're coming? No. Well, we're in an Air Force plane. Isn't that kind of like invading them or something? He says, you're going to fix all that, Martin. So with the pilot, there is an Air Force base at Suriname, capital, which is Paramaribo. Fortunately, there was someone manning the base, could turn on the lights. And we land our Air Force plane full of all of our Army people and security people and God knows what. I land there and they say, and explain to them what's going on. And of course, the officers in charge on there said the same thing. Do they know you're coming? I said, I'm going to fix it. So we don't have an ambassador to Suriname. We have a chargé d'affaires. So I get him out of bed and basically say, guess who's coming?
Guess who's coming?
Not only are we coming, but you got to get us an invitation to come. You got to wake up the government. And so that happened. And we're stuck there for a week.
Did you have to stay there through the whole
It
summer?
wasn't so bad. They had a beautiful hotel. And it was kind of a week off, but that was Air Force One.
You can't do another Air Force One because we're running out of time.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, yep. And the piece de resistance. I shouldn't try to speak French. Anyway,
Piece de resistance.
thank you. So it's 1968 and LBJ is having a very bad year. The anti-war protests, many of us were involved in them,
Yes.
had begun to really take off.
Many of you were involved in the anti-war progress, including my own children. They were marching on Pennsylvania Avenue outside the White House, and we could hear it. I had to actually go in to the president and explain that my kids were among the other kids out there, which didn't bother him at all. But Williamsburg, anyway, it was a bad time, as all of us will remember. The president could not go anywhere and make a speech without having demonstrations occurred that would drown him out. He hated the war, and I can go into that. We don't have time, but he did hate it, and he realized what it was doing to his Great Society program. And the only place he could make speeches, the only places were army bases or military bases. In any event, he called me in one day and said he wanted to take a weekend off. And he decided what he'd like to do is go to Colonial Williamsburg. For those of you who don't know, Williamsburg is a recreation of a colonial town. It's a marvelous place to visit. And it was developed by the Rockefeller family. He said, what I want to do is I want to go down there with like Linda and Lucy, but Linda especially because her husband, Chuck Robb, Marine, is going to be deployed to Vietnam very soon now. And what I want to do is play golf with him, have some time with my family, go to church on Sunday, and then come back. And I want it to be, of course, just a relaxing weekend. And I'd like you to go down there and arrange it. And I, of course, agreed to do that. First call I made was to Winthrop Rockefeller, who was then governor of Arkansas, and told him what the president needed and asked him if he could arrange for a place for us to stay and the golfing, which was no problem. And I said, we also want to go to church on Sunday. So do you have any recommendations? And he said, no problem about that. We have this Episcopal church in Williamsburg, and I know the preacher there very well, and he's a good man, and he'd be delighted to have you. So I got my team together, always getting teams together down there, and off we go to Williamsburg. The housing and the golf is nothing to arranging it. Together with a Secret Service agent, we decided we'd call on the preacher. I'm blocking on his name.
Oh,
Keys is that
no, his Coatsworth Pickney Lewis,
Coatsworth Pickney Lewis, Episcopal priest at Williamsburg.
a young guy, wasn't he?
No, he wasn't that young. But he was in his 50s. So the Secret Service and I go call on the Reverend, and I tell him we want to go to church. Does that give you any problem? He says, no, not at all. I said, well, I don't want the president to embarrass you or you be embarrassed in any way. And he said, no problem, Sherwin. He said, here's the sermon I plan to give anyway. I've already prepared it. And he showed it to me. We read it. And it was a nice service, a nice sermon. And I recommend.
No current events,
No. They were just,
talking about the Bible.
I don't remember what it was about, but I remember what it wasn't about. So I went back and I reported to Marvin, reported the president, that everything's in order, and down he came, the president, and went to play golf and a couple of times with Chuck, and I don't know who else. And then he went to church on Sunday. And he went to church. I didn't go in the church. I don't know. I had some things to do. So there's a motorcade, and I'm stationed down at the end of the motorcade doing whatever I'm doing while he's in church. After a while, suddenly the doors to the church burst open, and this gaggle of press who'd gone into the church with him come out yelling, "You'll never believe what happened in there." And I knew it. So a little while later, the president and Mrs. Johnson and his family come out. President's, just visualize it like it's today. He's standing on the steps right outside the church door, and he's looking around. And I know what he or who he's looking, and he spots me down at the end, and he goes like this. And he brings me to the car, the limousine he's in, and he starts in on me that this is the most terrible thing.
Now you have to
What the
tell,
president, what the Reverend had done, he'd spent the whole sermon excoriating Johnson over the Vietnam War. Johnson is sitting there helpless for the whole service, while this man is just giving it to him. And Johnson, of course, was, when he got with me, was livid. I can't state strongly enough how angry he was. And there's just no other target but me. I mean, I'm the one who investigated. I'm the one who recommended it, and I'm the one responsible. And, there's just no explaining to him that there was nothing more I could do. Except he said, you should have seen through that guy. And so he gives it to me. He gives it to me in the car. We get back to where he's staying. He goes off to play golf. He tells me to stay where I am. And he gives it to me when he comes back from golf. And I'm figuring to myself, well, I'm going to have a break because he's going to take the helicopter back. I'm going to go back with the Secret Service in a car. No, I have to ride back in the helicopter with him. So that begins a week of sheer hell for me. And I tried to resign.
you
You
did
won't hear
really
of it.
try to,
You won't hear of it. Marvin Watson, she says, just wait. And it was just hell that week. So at the end of that week, there is a White House dinner. with the president from some other country. I no longer remember which one. Well, the thing that happens at a White House dinner is that there's a receiving line. I mean, the president and Mrs. Johnson sit there and everybody who's invited goes through it. And you're introduced to the guest of honor and the president. So I'm there and I go into the receiving line and I get to the president. I had no idea what's going to happen. I get to the president, meet the president. He puts his arm around me and he says to this other president, you'd be so fortunate if you had somebody on your staff as competent as Sherwin here. My Lord. All is forgiven. But just the last thing. When I resigned finally, at tail end of 1968, when he wasn't going to see Congress, the president writes thank you letters, usually written by a speechwriter, and I got one of those. But I also got something else for the president. What I got was a handwritten note with his own black pen to me from him. And it read, no one in White House was more dedicated to country or more loyal to it than you. Thanks much again, Linda Johnson.
Perfect. Just perfect. And I actually was honored to see that. He obviously, Sherwin has that framed over his desk. Now we have just a very few moments because there's a lot that you've heard today that you're going to be thinking about. But Sherwin lives here. So if you don't get it to ask a question or make a comment today, find him in the dining room. Call him up. That's all right with you. Okay. Does anybody have anything they want to say?
Thank you.
You're all quite welcome. I just want to say about Cathedral Village.
Wait a second.
I'm sure I feel very fortunate to be here. And I just love this place. And I'm learning to love Philadelphia.
Well, the mayor is going to be really glad to hear that.
Right.
Okay. Thanks again.
Well, thank you all.
And actually,
I'm honored that you spent the time listening to my little adventures. I'm just a guy from Iowa that these things happen to. Not so special, but I'm so pleased to share them with you.
well, we're thrilled to be in your audience.
Thank you.
Thank you
Okey-doke.
so much. We can't wait to hear more stories. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, actually, what Sherwin told me, cheered me up after we were going over this. He said, well, after they get over, so maybe a year from now, we'll talk about sailing.
Yeah, my wife and I lived on a sailboat for 8 years and we had
Oh,
some
my God.
fascinating adventures.
So I think that might be kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah. That'll be fun. Thank
Okey-doke.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Oh, you're welcome.